Yeah. As I got another rhyme, another rhythm for y'all to listen. I'm never quitting on my mission. I'ma roll with what I'm giving. Got some ambition, this new edition, filling positions. Looking at the void in myself and feeling what's missing. Better watch the way you going, better go in the right direction. In the moment you stressing, but you gon' be counting blessings. And I know that for certain. Keep on working, open curtains, haters swerving, cause they ain't ready for your final version. Whoa. I'm never gonna give up, fall down, I just
You're
gotta
listening
get
to the
up,
Tom
get
Ficklin
up,
Show on
yeah.
WNHHLP 103.5 FM, your home for community radio.
Good morning, everyone. Good morning, good morning, good morning. Just before we went on air, we were discussing history to some degree, and this is the end of Black History Month, but I call this month actually Black History Month, Black Her Story Month, because again, how do we kind of understand our collective kind of commitment and not be distracted by words, and just understand how the spirit is moving. Today, we're going to be not necessarily metaphorical, but really talk about history and her story, not in terms of folks that are on the planet today, and in terms of honoring our ancestors. But what about our future family, the future collective family of mankind? How do we kind of decide that life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness will be available to all moving forward? Specifically, we're going to talk about, if not a solution, a collective solution, or what happens, how do we kind of create and establish a collective solution to Alzheimer's disease? Today we call it Alzheimer's disease or dementia, and tomorrow we might call it something else. But the fact remains that people are living longer, and believe it or not, over 6 million people currently are living with Alzheimer's disease. So certainly if you're listening to this show, you know someone that you know knows someone that's been afflicted. But more importantly, this is a proactive show about the future. What is the impact of clinical research and science and the science of discovery? And we're so blessed to have Dr. Ryan O'Dell with us. Dr. Ryan O'Dell is a doctor, assistant professor at the Yale Alzheimer's Disease Research Unit, Department of Psychiatry, Yale University School of Medicine. We're blessed to have Vanessa Clayton, Community Diversity Engagement Research Associate at the Yale Alzheimer's Disease Research Unit, Department of Psychiatry, Yale University School of Medicine. And we're joined by Reverend Dr. Leroy O. Perry Jr., pastor of St. Stephen's AME Church and cultural ambassador to the Yale Clinical Research Program, and Reverend Elvin Clayton, pastor Walters Memorial AME Zion Church and cultural ambassador to the Yale Clinical Research Program. Welcome and good morning, everyone.
Good morning.
Good morning.
And so again, just before we jump in with Reverend Clayton and Reverend Perry to kind of share with us some thoughts and to establish us in terms of this historical perspective, let me just say, this is a tremendous show about solutions, collective solutions. We don't have to just honor or pray, but we can take prayerful action and faith in our actions. Reverend Perry and Reverend Clayton, kick us off a little bit about we know that folks are living longer and what it might take, this impact of this disease, and how we can kind of challenge people and make sure that that we're not overlooked and lost in the shuffle, so to speak.
Thank you, Tom. I think this is a very important show for us, because a lot of our seniors are facing early stages of Alzheimer's. I think this show will enlighten our audience with regards to risk factors, environmental and genetic, and possibly point to new therapies that are available. And this information doesn't normally get to our community, so I'm very happy that Ryan and Vanessa are here to kind of wade us through this maze, because it is really difficult to understand.
Reverend Clayton.
Thank you, Tom. And I was looking and I heard your first thought or your first question, that word was overlooked. The challenges of our seniors, that make sure they're not overlooked. And one of the ways that we make sure that doesn't happen, we got to be in close contact with them, visit them often. If you have a parent that doesn't live with you, you got to make sure someone is visiting them often, daily. Also, you got to make sure they're up to date with their meds, because sometimes an older person may not take the medications. Make sure they're eating properly. And you may have to do some things that they may not want, like taking their the car away. You know, all of these things are part of what we need to do to make sure that they're not overlooked and abused. Watch their money. Check out their finances. So that's where my head is with this area.
Well, absolutely, absolutely. Just what you mentioned, a few friends crossed my consciousness just as you were speaking, that who family members had to act in the way that you just suggested. Dr. Odell, good morning. Kick us off a little bit more about your work as a researcher, and actually how, if you don't mind, how you became interested in this research of this really challenging but so impactful area of clinical study. And if I can just throw in why it's personally important to you.
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks, Tom. So a little bit of background for me. I did my medical school and graduate training in SUNY Upstate Medical University, so out in Syracuse, New York. I was there for almost a decade doing this training, and I did my PhD training in basic science research, more in the field of developmental neurobiology. It was a lot of microscope work, studying the effect of certain proteins on mouse brain development. So, really nothing to do with Alzheimer's disease or clinical trials at all. But, as I went through medical school, I found I really was interested in all things psychiatry. I liked all the rotations, child psychiatry, consult services, inpatient, outpatient, but really, took a shining to, geriatric psychiatry, and specifically, geriatric psychiatry in the context of a cognitive disorder such as Alzheimer's disease. And the more I learned about it, the more I realized how much of a need there was, not just from a clinical perspective, but a research perspective. We need to better understand the disease process, what drives it, what causes it, but also try to develop more efficacious treatments, things that work, to actually halt or at least slow the progression. So with that in mind, I joined the psychiatry residency program at Yale here from 2017 to about 2021. And that's when I started working with Dr. Christopher Van Dyke and Dr. Adam Mecca, here at the Yale Alzheimer's Disease Research Unit. And, they really gave me the time and opportunity to kind of shift gears completely and start working on, learning more about brain imaging studies and clinical trials in Alzheimer's disease. So then I finished the residency training, did a fellowship in geriatric psychiatry, which is, here in New Haven, based primarily out of the West Haven VA. Continued to work with the ADRU, in the field of Alzheimer's disease. And then finally, after 15 years of training, started here as faculty, this past July 2022 as a geriatric psychiatrist and cognitive disorder specialist. So I do have to say, my decision to completely shift gears from basic science research to, clinical trials in Alzheimer's disease is one, that's been very fulfilling. I don't regret it at all. I said earlier, there's a really, big or huge unmet need in this field that we're all working towards. And,
Yes.
I've really enjoyed all my interactions with the research participants, my clinical patients, their families, caregivers. This is a disease that affects not just the person, but the family, the community, the healthcare system, in a lot of significant ways. So something I'm really passionate about.
Absolutely. And just before, and we are going to delve into the AHEAD research program and studying how folks can kind of get involved with that. But Vanessa, kind of same general question. How did you decide to kind of get involved with this really significant and impactful research?
First of all, thank you for inviting us and highlighting this important issue. I could say that I am now part of the older population, so I think I need to stay on top of everything that's affecting senior citizens, but not only for myself, for my family, my friends, the communities I serve. I've been involved in other clinical trials over the years, but this is an opportunity, I think, to be in the forefront of making an impact on the Black and Brown communities. However, now this disease does not just affect the older population. I lost a very dear classmate who developed early onset Alzheimer's in his 50s and passed away at age 63. So hopefully the results of this study can also go a long way to prevent Alzheimer's disease somehow or have an impact on the younger population as well. So when I heard about the position, coupled with my science teaching background and my work with community outreach, I thought I could be effective and make a difference.
Excellent. And Dr. Odell, before we go into the AHEAD study, just let's give us a little context, because again, although the word, people have heard the word, but I don't think we can, it would be remiss not to give people a little more context about the disease and how it develops, because again, it's an evolving kind of situation, early warning signs, et cetera. So share with us a little bit about your understanding of the disease and how it develops.
Yeah, absolutely. And that's a very, big and important question. And, there's a bunch I can cover here. So just jump in, let me know if I'm talking too much and we need to move on. But, I would start out with a, brief definition, that Alzheimer's disease is defined as, a slowly progressive neurodegenerative disease that causes decline in people's cognition, so their memory and thinking, and their function, their ability to live independently and complete, daily tasks. It is the most common form of dementia, or common type of dementia. And as you mentioned, there's over 6 million Americans currently diagnosed. And unfortunately, as the population ages, that number is projected to more than double to about 13.8 million people living with Alzheimer's disease by about the year 2060 is the estimate we currently have. And I'd also say maybe here's a good place to pause and point out a few definitions. Like, these are things that come up pretty frequently in the clinic and in the research environment. Somebody might come in and say, one doctor said I had a diagnosis of dementia, or my loved one has a diagnosis of dementia. Somebody else says I have Alzheimer's disease. What's going on? What's the difference? So just to point out here, dementia is not a specific disease, but it's what we call a syndrome, or a group of symptoms that typically kind of occur together. And the technical diagnosis, for dementia is characterized by these objective, measurable impairments in cognition. That could be memory, language, judgment, problem solving, really any aspect of cognition that of course represents a decline from previous levels of functioning, but also interferes with somebody's ability to function independently. And as you kind of alluded to earlier, that could manifest as maybe needing assistance with driving, managing bills, medications, those sort of things. And maybe another term to point out here, which we might, throw around today, or other listeners have heard, is called mild cognitive impairment, or MCI. So mild cognitive impairment, I think of, with mild cognitive impairment and dementia as a spectrum, with MCI being a little bit earlier on that spectrum. And technically, a diagnosis of mild cognitive impairment, is defined as having those same objective deficits or impairments in cognition, similar to that, criteria for dementia, but the individual is still fully functional and independent with all their, aspects of daily living. So that's kind of some differences in some technical terms that might get thrown around. But kind of getting back to Alzheimer's disease. So if somebody has a diagnosis of this mild cognitive impairment or dementia, the next logical question might be, well, what's causing this diagnosis? What's causing my memory and thinking changes? And that's where Alzheimer's disease comes in. Alzheimer's disease is the potential cause, or what we call etiology, of the cognitive and functional impairment of the dementia. And as I mentioned before, it is the most common cause of dementia, but there's many other things that specialists need to think about that could be, contributing to the symptoms depending on, presenting signs. There's things like vascular brain disease, Parkinson's disease can cause dementia, something called Lewy body disease, a whole host of things, and things we really need to think about. But maybe a little more information on Alzheimer's disease specifically. You noted it's just characteristically, at least, a disease of, older age. And in fact, age is the largest risk factor to developing Alzheimer's disease. And there's sort of late onset forms where the symptoms start after the age of 65. And as Vanessa mentioned, early onset, where just symptoms happen before the age of 65.
Right.
And let's see, I think maybe a few other helpful pieces. I would say, well, actually, maybe the last, maybe most important thing to talk about here, in relation to the rest of today's talk, the pathology, what's driving, the Alzheimer's disease, and what we call neurodegeneration or cell death. So Alzheimer's disease, we typically is characterized by the accumulation of two different proteins, by amyloid plaques and tau tangles. Those are, again, some words people might hear thrown around, plaques and tangles. And so these are two proteins that accumulate or aggregate in the brain and cause the neuronal injury or brain cell death and injury. And the amyloid protein is accumulating outside of the brain cells, while the aggregated tau protein is accumulating, within the neurons. So this is, kind of a double whammy. There's damage happening from both sides, both within and outside of these brain cells. And I think this is important to point out because a lot of the ongoing clinical trials in Alzheimer's disease, including the AHEAD study, that we're talking about today, are trying to use drugs to target either these amyloid plaques or these tau tangles for removal and clearance from the brain. They're essentially trying to remove these sources of neuronal toxicity and damage in an effort to treat the disease.
Excellent, excellent. And we are going to go to the AHEAD study because it just occurred to me, Reverend Clayton and Reverend Perry and Vanessa, as every show that we've done in terms of the cultural ambassadors has been a historical show, but it dawns on me that we're trying to recruit people to participate in clinical studies, but that's everyone might not be able to write a history book or be an author or give a speech, but you can participate in history by participating in these clinical trials. You, in fact, can be an agent of change by participating in clinical trials. You can make history, but just before we go to the AHEAD study, Dr. Odell, just share with us also in terms of any, and I know it might be somewhat subjective or speculative, but early warning signs. Are there any early warning signs of Alzheimer's? And again, I realize you might be hesitating to specifically answer that question because people might accuse, my wife, my husband, or people might throw around this accusation and part of their arguments with people. But are there any early warning signs of Alzheimer's that we should be aware of?
Yeah, absolutely. So this is a great question. And, I think I may have alluded to earlier, the most common presenting symptom of Alzheimer's disease is changes in memory and thinking. And it's primarily memory. Memory is that first, aspect or domain of cognition. It's not always the first one, but it's the most common one that's affected first in Alzheimer's disease. So, common symptoms that people might notice are increasing forgetfulness, increasing repetitiveness, maybe repeating or forgetting conversations from earlier that day or the previous day, maybe losing items around the house like wallet, keys, and papers, pretty consistently. And as I kind of mentioned before, this should be a change from a previous, level of performance, something new or concerning. And although the memory or these amnestic, symptoms are the most common or typical, there's definitely other, cognitive domains that can be affected. A lot of times people will experience language changes, trouble finding the right word, some sort of fancy neurological term called circumlocution, using a lot of words to talk around an answer in a kind of vague way, where you're not really sure you got the answer to a direct question by the end of it.
I thought that was. I thought that's what politicians do.
It is. It's a legal term. Yep, it is.
Okay.
Yep.
Right, I'm sorry.
Yep.
Go ahead.
No,
Okay.
no. It's a legal term, but it's also can happen with neurodegenerative changes as well, as long as it's not, intentional. And so other people might experience difficulty keeping track of events like dates, appointments, medications, managing those, maybe increased trouble with navigation. But maybe in the earlier stages of Alzheimer's disease, those navigation or orientation difficulties are more seen in uncommon locations. Like I'm driving to a new city I've never been to, not typically getting lost in familiar local neighborhoods. That might happen later on in the disease course, but not early on. Some other, informal things we use in the clinic, if somebody's working, I always ask about, are you having increasing trouble at work, struggling with things that you've always been able to do, pretty quickly and efficiently that now, are a little more concerning to you, maybe trouble with technology like phones and computers. I used to be a software designer, a computer whiz, and now I'm struggling to use software I've used for the last 10 or 15 years. And maybe the last thing I would point out there or here in terms of, things to look for or talk about in terms of Alzheimer's disease and memory changes, I would say it affects short-term memory first. That's why we ask about rapid forgetting, of recently learned or new information, that increased repetitiveness. And as the disease progresses, the longer term memories, things from 10, 20, 40 years ago, childhood memories, those are affected much later in the disease process. And I only bring this up as an important point. In the clinic, I might often hear, a family member might not necessarily be concerned about a loved one's memory because they're saying, well, they still recognize me. They still recognize the family members, even though they're not, even though they are having rapid forgetting or maybe can't use their phone. And I think it's just an opportunity to provide some, information or psychoeducation about how the disease process works. It affects, the short-term memory first and kind of moves backwards in time. So those longer memories from childhood or remembering your spouse or children, those things are not affected, at least early on. And I would say, just in terms of maybe the warning signs, when to reach out for help or support. Again, if there's any of these short-term changes in short-term memory, those repetitiveness, forgetfulness, that's a change from your baseline, your previous level of functioning. I would recommend people reach out to their primary care physician, their PCP for help. The PCP may directly refer them, to somebody like me, a cognitive disorder specialist. They may collect a little more information about the nature of the symptoms, get some examples, maybe do a brief lab workup. But I would say, that would be, one opportunity. If you have concerns, reach out to your physician. And if they're not sure, they would certainly, or should certainly, refer you to a memory specialist. And we'd be able to tease out, like you mentioned, there are actually expected changes as we age. It's not fair to compare our memory in our 60s, 70s, 80s to when we were 20 or 30. And that's where the memory specialist can be helpful. Is this consistent with what we call normal cognitive aging or healthy cognitive aging, or something more pathological like Alzheimer's disease?
Excellent.
I have a question, Tom. I have a question.
Absolutely, sir. Yes, sir.
Dr. Odell mentioned that over 6 million Americans has been diagnosed or have Alzheimer's, and I would imagine that as they get older, it probably gets worse. But I read that Blacks are twice as likely to have Alzheimer's and dementia as our white brothers and sisters. Can you kind of tell us why, or do you know why that's the case?
Yeah, no, that's a great question. And I know a very helpful resource that I've found is the Alzheimer's Association. They come out with this sort of facts and figures report every year with, prevalence and incidence and demographic information. And you're right, one of the figures they quote is, Blacks and African Americans are twice as likely to have a diagnosis of Alzheimer's disease or another dementia. Hispanic populations are 1.5 times more likely. And the real unfortunate thing is, despite this higher prevalence in these communities, they're actually less likely to be formally diagnosed. And they're diagnosed at later stages when there's more physical and cognitive impairment. So there's like a double inequity there. But in terms of what's causing it, I think that's less clear. I know initially, the field kind of pointed to genetics. At first, there's a certain gene, a risk gene called the ApoE4 gene. That's a little more prevalent. You can have 1 or 2 copies, and the more copies you have, the more likely you are to develop Alzheimer's disease than somebody with no copies of this risk gene. And for whatever reason, there's a few studies that point to say the Black population has a little higher incidence or prevalence of this risk gene than, say, their white counterparts. But that sort of theory has been largely debunked, I think. And, the genetics cannot explain fully this difference. So one of my thoughts is, honestly, sort of, racialized inequities in healthcare. And one of that is because there's vascular risk factors, right? There's these high blood pressure, diabetes, high cholesterol. These are all risk factors for something we call vascular dementia, but they're also risk factors for Alzheimer's disease. And those are medical diagnoses that are more common in underrepresented groups. But I don't think it's because there's an inherent genetic or ethnic or racial difference. I think it's because of a history of, medical racism and, unequal access to healthcare that put these populations to have these higher risk factors that then, as they age, increases the risk of Alzheimer's disease. So that's another, theory as to why there's, twice the amount of people diagnosed with Alzheimer's disease.
Excellent. And Dr. Odell and Vanessa, because before we have about 35 minutes that we can spend on the head study, and we're going to really dive into that, because again, I guess I want to repeat, folks, you can participate in history, you can impact history and her story and his story. But I just wanted to ask everyone before we go there, and we referenced it a little bit, but the stresses and challenges on the family and the community, it might be sound repetitive, but I think it's really important to let everybody know that whether you're 10, 11, 12, 20, 30, you can help our families and our future families thrive and survive by knowing this information and sharing this information. So I guess I wonder, Reverend Perry, if you want to kick us off about the impact on loved ones and your family and your church and your organizations, unless we become more proactive.
Thank you, Tom. I think that Dr. Odell, what you're saying is what medical doctors are saying now about social determinants of health and how significant that is when we look at these outcomes. So it's kind of, like if you look at sporadic Alzheimer's, or if you look at familial Alzheimer's, you kind of caught in between. And what the social determinants of health does, I think it makes clear that you've got to look at all of the components in order to arrive at a conclusion that makes sense. Otherwise, you're guessing for the most part. I think that one of the problems we have with our community is access. So, for example, if I knew of a person that had all of the symptoms that's listed on the web and from our conversation, getting them the help that they need is the difficult part. And I think that what your study does for us, it helps us to be able to say, listen, there is a study out there. You may want to check with your doctor, but there is a study out there that may help you, your sister, your cousin, and everybody else. We just have to look at how you can get in the study. What are the criteria? I think Vanessa had said one time that you wouldn't take anybody as old as Reverend Clayton or Reverend or Tom Ficklin, but I'm sure there might be some other studies that they could get into. I was going to challenge you, Doctor, to give Reverend Clayton and Reverend and Tom a quick question just to see if they were mentally alert this morning.
Indeed.
But, I'm going to pass on that and let you tell us about this particular study that you're doing and the ramifications, if there's a cost included, if there are barriers to getting in the study, and when the study begins and ends. I think that would help us all.
Okay, let's Dr. Odell, the gauntlet has been passed to you.
All right.
Lovingly, though. Let me say lovingly and carefully, but it's been and to you and Vanessa.
Yes. Go ahead, Vanessa. Sorry.
Well, first of all, that Alzheimer's Association facts and figures tell us that only 35% of Blacks say they're even concerned about Alzheimer's disease, but 65% say that they know someone with it. And again, half of the population thinks it's just a normal process of aging that really can't be helped or stopped. So that's the first kind of barrier that just keeps people from wanting to get involved. We have to publicize these facts because of the abnormal number of Blacks who have this disease. We must continue to search for the cause and the cure and make sure that the facts are given so that people will want to get ahead of this study. And that's exactly what this study is about.
I want to ask you this. When you say that 35% are not concerned, do you think that 35% are people who really have no clue? It's like, if you think that you're healthy and you can go to work and you can come home and you can feed your family, do you think I have time to figure out, unless I got some symptoms that make me want to reassess where I am right now? And I think that is what, I mean, and I think for Black populations, that's the case on a lot of things. It's like my father never stopped to go and get checked until he really had to. We never went to the emergency room until we needed to. Whereas our white our counterparts, they got regular checkups and their doctors spent time with them on different things. We go in, we get seen for 8 seconds, 8 minutes, and then we're gone. This is a systemic problem. And I think that we got to deal with that.
And that's what happens especially with older Americans who are living alone, staying alone. I can speak from personal perspective. We took in my uncle at age 86, just before COVID shut down. He lived alone. He had significant health issues, but he didn't have any dementia, thank God. We were able to take him in and care for him and take him to his appointments. Whereas in the past, he said, oh, yeah, I go to this doctor and we sit around and talk about baseball. He checks my blood pressure and listens to my heart and sends me home. Well, no. Now that I'm here and taking you, we'll ask a lot of questions. And we went to every specialist, the neurologist and all the specialists, and, went through the process. But prior to that, he wasn't really honing in on his issues. Now, if he had dementia, now he was able to interact with the family, once COVID kind of opened things up, once things opened up again, he was able to travel with us. He participated in family functions, went to church. But if he had had dementia, none of that would have been possible. We would not have been able to care for him. Even with the home health aides that came in, would not have been enough. It's such a debilitating disease. And by the time you recognize that you have it, it's almost too late. And so that's why getting ahead of it early on is so important.
And COVID didn't help.
No,
No, not at all.
So that's the cue, Dr. Odell and Vanessa. Walk us down the AHEAD study, because I love the acronym AHEAD rather than just being reactive or putting our heads in the sand. This is a perspective study. So tell us about the AHEAD study. We have 25 minutes or so to really take the deep dive. And as Reverend Perry mentioned, to share with people how they can get involved and whether there's any compensation, et cetera.
Yeah, maybe I can take the first part about, what sort of the study is looking to investigate. And I think before I jump into the AHEAD study, I just want to take 1 minute to maybe back up a little bit and introduce a different study, that's going to help clarify, I think, the purpose and goals of AHEAD. So the study I'm talking about, actually the results of a large phase 3 clinical trial called Clarity AD, that investigated the use of an amyloid clearing antibody called lecanemab. That's the name of the drug we're going to be talking about, in symptomatic stages of Alzheimer's disease. So people with mild cognitive impairment and mild dementia. The results of this study was recently published and had positive results. It was a 1.5-year study conducted in participants between the age of 50 and 90 years old who were in those early symptomatic stages. So they had memory and thinking symptoms, and it was due to Alzheimer's disease. They had those elevated levels of amyloid plaque in the brain. So that they received these infusions of lecanemab or placebo every 2 weeks for the 1.5 years. And the study showed that this lecanemab medication slowed the rate of cognitive decline in Alzheimer's disease by about 27%, and also reduced the levels of that brain amyloid. So it demonstrated, I'd say, a clear yet modest clinical benefit. And because of those findings, the sponsor, the pharmaceutical company, has, the FDA actually approved this medication for clinical use under their accelerated pathway. So not a traditional pathway, but an accelerated pathway this past January, and they're currently applying for traditional approval. So that's the background. But moving ahead to the AHEAD study, this is a 4-year clinical trial. So instead of 1.5 years, it's 4 years, and we're testing whether the intervention of removing or clearing this amyloid protein using lecanemab prior to the onset of any symptoms could help prevent future memory loss and dementia caused by Alzheimer's disease. So, of course, that means the intervention here that we're using in AHEAD is the same FDA-approved medication, this lecanemab that I just described, that showed efficacy in symptomatic Alzheimer's disease. But now it's being studied in the earlier pre-symptomatic stages of Alzheimer's disease. So, the participants who are enrolling and potentially eligible for this study have no objective impairments. They may have some subjective concerns. They may have a family history, but they have no measurable impairments on tests of memory and thinking, i.e. they might be what we call cognitively normal or healthy cognition. But they have elevated levels of amyloid in their brain. One of these pathologic proteins that's accumulating that puts them at future risk for developing symptomatic Alzheimer's disease. And so that's again
what age group again is eligible?
I believe for
55 to 80 for this study.
Yep.
Okay.
Yep, 55 to 80, and that's usually that's where the AHEAD name comes from. We're trying to get ahead of Alzheimer's disease and remove and clear this plaque before it can potentially cause any clinical symptoms. And I guess maybe a little more information about we can get into some specifics. I would say it's actually made up of 2 different studies. This one AHEAD study, so the A3 and the A45 arm. And so participants who meet eligibility criteria, which we can talk more about the details of that, are kind of put into one of 2 arms of the study. The A3 arm is made up of participants who have intermediate levels of brain amyloid. So they're not really high, but it's not negative. It's somewhere in between at an intermediate level. They receive monthly infusions of lecanemab versus placebo for 4 years. So once a month infusion for 4 years. And the goal with this A3 trial is to intervene at the earliest possible stages of the disease process when this brain amyloid may be just beginning to accumulate. if somebody screens into the study and we find they have an elevated or a high amount of amyloid in the brain based on a PET scan, which I can talk about, they go into they're eligible for the A45 arm. And so that's again made up of participants with higher levels of brain amyloid, but are still testing in normal ranges on cognitive tests. And so they get infusions of lecanemab or placebo every 2 weeks for 2 years. And then at the 2-year halfway point, they switch to monthly infusions for the last 2 years of the study. And I think maybe the last thing I'll point out here before we dive into more detail is, it's important to just note, I keep saying lecanemab versus placebo. So this is a placebo-controlled study. And what that means is that participants in both the A3, the intermediate level, and the A45, the elevated level of amyloid trials, are randomly assigned, get a 50-50 chance to either receive this lecanemab, the study drug, or the placebo, no drug. And because it's also what we call, double blind, that means neither the participant, the person receiving the infusions, nor the investigators, us, know what they're getting, whether they're getting placebo or the study drug, until the end of the study when everything's unblinded. So maybe let me pause there and see, Vanessa, if you have if you want to talk maybe about inclusion criteria, and I can kind of walk people through the screening process, maybe.
Well, initially, again, if you're relatively healthy and you're between that age group of 55 to 80, you do qualify to be for an intake. And we could even do that by telephone. Once the intake, we get your medical history and other information about yourself, your living conditions, et cetera, then we invite you in to be screened. And we go through and at that point they do a blood test, a urine test, and they get you set up for MRI and PET scan, and that will determine those biomarkers, how much amyloid plaque is built up in your brain. And from that point
Vanessa,
on,
and Vanessa,
yes.
how does a person? I want you to mention it now, and we'll mention it at the end of the show. How does a person explore, signing up or being in touch with you guys?
Their telephone number and email address, et cetera. Organizations can invite us in to do presentations, the website, anything like that. I'll give my phone numbers whenever you're ready.
Please share it now, and also share it at the end. Not the number that Reverend Clayton has, but your public number.
He probably doesn't even have my office number yet.
All right.
Because we communicate by cell phone. But
all right.
My office number is right here, downtown New Haven. It's 203-764-5786. The main office number to get even more information, or if I'm not available, is 203-764-8100.
Excellent.
My email address is vanessa.clayton@yale.edu. And there's a website, www.alzheimers.yale.edu.
Excellent.
Yeah, I want to ask a question about the placebo so it's a 4-year study.
Yes.
If I'm getting a placebo that doesn't do anything, that means for 4 years, my Alzheimer's is just going to get worse and it's not going to get better. Is that fair?
No, it's a good question, and I think it's one of the difficulties of designing these type of trials. I would say, one thing is we don't know how much risk having elevated amyloid when you have no cognitive symptoms or memory symptoms confers. I think in terms of later developing symptomatic Alzheimer's disease, there was a bunch of studies. I think they were autopsy studies, so people who died of other causes, not Alzheimer's disease. And then we can now, do brain imaging and look for amyloid. I think they found in older adults, up to 30% of people who either, died of some other disease process or of natural causes, who had no, cognitive impairment, they had elevated, amyloid levels. So the question is, if they have lived for another 10, 20 years, would they have developed symptoms? And we there's more and more evidence in the field, I would say, accumulating that these amyloid plaques can be accumulating up to 20 years before the appearance of any, memory symptoms, like any objective memory decline. And we still don't know, although we're trying to investigate it with our observational studies, not a clinical trial, having, say, high amyloid, and maybe one of these risk genes, what sort of risk does that confer? It would be nice to eventually tell people, what is your 5-year or 10-year, risk of converting to having memory symptoms based on this brain scan and this genetic test. But we're just not there yet, unfortunately. And I think that's why they have to design this placebo-controlled study, which in some ways can be informative. The people who we eventually find out who are on placebo, how many of them, converted to having symptoms? Is it none? Is it 5%, 30%? And invariably, there's always what we call these open label extensions, at the end of these clinical trials, where at some point, everybody just gets the study drug. There's no more placebo. And that's, in my, limited experience as a, researcher in Alzheimer's disease, most of these clinical trials have ended up in an open label extension where eventually everybody gets the study drug for another, say 1.5 to 2 years. So that may, in some ways kind of, not make up for, but kind of answer that question of, there's some people who got the study drug and others didn't. But it's a good question. Yeah.
Right. But remember, you have to be relatively healthy. You cannot have Alzheimer's in order to participate in this particular study.
But you won't know that until you do the testing, or what level the person is. So when I could think I'm normal, but it's not until I go through all of the rigorous testing will you have a knowledge. And then so when you do this testing, will I get this information so that if I say, you know what, I think I just need to go and find me the best medicine or the best cognitive doctor right now so that I can, maybe go that route. And the other question I had is when the study is over, it's like when the Pfizer study was over, everybody got the drug. As it got to the end, when it was a world approved, everybody got the Pfizer drug in the blind study. Everybody got it. So here's a question as ambassadors that we always really want to ask is like, when the drug is approved, will it be available to the people in the study? And the other question is, how much will it cost other people? I know it takes a lot to do these studies. So, it could be out of my pocket range. I'm 80 years old. I'm on Social Security now. I know this drug helps me, but you're telling me the study is over and I can't afford the drug.
Yeah, which there's a lot of good points and questions there. I can speak to the in terms of just the financial cost. We have a little bit of evidence, I guess, from this other medication, a similar, to this lecanemab medication. There's another one called aducanumab that was FDA approved for Alzheimer's use in symptomatic Alzheimer's disease back in June of 2021. There was a lot of controversy around that one. That was technically the first one to be approved. But I think it started out at I don't know if it was $58,000 a year because the Centers for Medicaid and Medicare, the CMS, said, we're not going to cover it. There needs more evidence. And so it ended up being who can afford that? Almost $60,000 a year. So they lowered it to $20,000 to $28,000 a year, but still not covered by insurance. And I think what's going to happen is, now that lecanemab's been approved through this accelerated pathway, there was another one that the FDA looked at but denied. I think lecanemab is going to be approved through the traditional pathway. And then the CMS, the Centers for Medicaid and Medicare, are going to have to reevaluate their statement that now we have this standard of care that they, really need to consider hard about, covering, so it can be, equitable to everybody, because it's just, you're right, it's too expensive. Even at $28,000, that's still a crazy high, price to pay out of pocket.
Yes.
And
I'm going to the health food store.
Reverend Perry raises a good question about this dynamic between people versus profits, and that's part of our economic system at the moment. Let me ask the question a different way, Dr. Odell. If a blockbuster drug, if I participate in the study, passed a medical screening, and then a blockbuster drug appears on the market, am I eligible to take it?
I would say yes, absolutely. And that would be unethical, of us as clinicians to deny the
Right.
standard of care. And that's been, on our mind as a field since, aducanumab was approved in 2020, June 2021. And we're really kind of pushing the sponsors, people who are designing these, up and coming clinical trials, not just the AHEAD study. We've asked them, if lecanemab is FDA approved and clinically available, are people going to be able to enroll in your study? Are you going to have an arm where somebody is getting lecanemab plus your new study drug, and people, who don't want to take it clinically and on the study drug? We really need to think about, redesigning clinical trials. And I would say, if maybe another way to answer that is, if there was a situation where you're currently enrolled in a clinical trial and you're not, you don't know if you're on placebo or getting a study drug, and lecanemab is FDA approved and can be prescribed by a memory specialist, and you have symptoms, if you meet criteria for it to get it clinically, we would want to tell you about that, and talk with you about, if the study doesn't let you continue, what would you want to do? Should you drop out of the study and get the standard of care medication? If for whatever reason that study said, no, you can't start this, and be in our trial, then we would, have an informed consent discussion with you and your study partner, in terms of what we thought might be the best option for clinical care and standard of care. But yeah, there is no way it should be. If it's, readily available and affordable and accessible, there's no way we should be denying that to people who are in clinical trials.
Right.
So doctor, the study that you're in now, the drug that you're using, you're looking for it to effectively wipe out the cells that may be damaging your brain, basically?
So maybe not the cells, but the proteins that the cells are making to get rid of the amyloid. Yep.
And that's different from the drug that's out now.
No, they're actually I guess you mean the aducanumab drug, the other one I mentioned? Yeah, they work the same way. They both are what we call, monoclonal antibodies. We use these monoclonal antibodies in cancers a lot to target specific cells, in cancer for, the cancer cells for destruction. But in this case, these antibodies are going into the brain and recognizing the amyloid protein and clearing it from the brain. So both aducanumab and lecanemab work the same way. They're both clearing plaque. I would say from the evidence we have so far on both of them, aducanumab is a, once monthly infusion, whereas lecanemab, at least as of now, in symptomatic Alzheimer's disease, is every 2 weeks. So there's a difference there in terms of how much time you need to come in and get infusions. They both have the same rate of slowing, 25 to 27% slowing of decline in Alzheimer's disease. So they both are doing, well, about the same, I would say, in slowing the rate of decline. But from the evidence we have, there's actually, I think, it seems less side effects with lecanemab. So that may be an important, decision, in speaking to patients. If both of these medications are available, what's right for you? Do you want the one where you have to come in once monthly or twice monthly? Would it be better to have the one with, less side effects? So they both work the same way, and have a similar, slowing of the disease process, but come with different side effect profiles and I guess how you infuse the drug, or sort of the protocol. Yeah.
What are some of the side effects?
Yeah, so I would say the most common side effects we see with both of these medications, maybe not unexpected, are called infusion-related side effects. So if somebody kind of has a reaction to the infusion itself, like an allergic reaction, which we can treat with, Benadryl and Tylenol, they're typically, benign. But the most common side effects that we talk to people about, if we were to prescribe this medication clinically, and also in the research study, we have in-depth discussions during the informed consent, about them, are called, they're imaging findings. The acronym is ARIA, ARIA, so amyloid-related imaging abnormalities. And they kind of come in two flavors. One of them is ARIA-E, or edema. So we've noticed in lecanemab, and I'm going to scroll down so I don't misquote the number, I think about 12% of people on the lecanemab study drug in the symptomatic, Alzheimer's disease experienced a little bit of what we call cerebral edema, so brain swelling. And then I think another 15 to 17, or actually 14% of people on lecanemab experienced small, what we call microhemorrhages. So bleeds in the brain that were less than 10 millimeters. The vast majority, I think upwards of 70 to 80% of these findings were asymptomatic. That's why they call them the imaging findings. Nobody had any symptoms. You know, I'm going to make sure I can get you the exact number here so I don't misquote. Yeah, 78% with lecanemab who had symptomatic Alzheimer's disease were asymptomatic. We just found them on the brain imaging. 70% of them occurred within the first 3 months. So if they're going to happen early. And then about 81% of them resolved. So the brain swelling went away and there were no more, brain bleeds after 4 months of detection. And we have, very strict protocols in place to monitor for these. We check in about symptoms. The most common symptoms, if somebody had that minor swelling, might be headaches, vision changes, confusion. So we're checking in with people, clinical check-ins during the research study. And if I was prescribing it, I'd be doing that too, checking in to make sure you're not experiencing side effects. And then there's MRIs pretty frequently throughout the study. I think, at baseline, at month 2 and month 3 after the infusions, then every 3 months until like week 48, and then every 6 months. And if we find anything, if we see one of these events of brain swelling or a microhemorrhage, it triggers, there's a whole bunch of decision trees we go through. If it's mild, mild looking on the brain scan on the MRI and you have no symptoms, we can continue to give you the infusions, but we would now start doing MRIs monthly where we wouldn't have done that before to make sure it's not getting worse. If it got worse or you ever had a new symptom, hey, I have a new headache and I've never had headaches before, and we saw these findings, we would stop the study drug. So we'd stop the infusions and you'd just get monthly MRIs and check-ins, clinical check-ins, until those symptoms and the imaging findings resolved and went away. And then you could go back on the study drug if you wanted to. So we're very, careful, and have rigorous, sort of checks in place to make sure we're administering this safely. And we should be doing that in the clinic too. Once these are commercially and clinically available, the people prescribing them are going to want to be experts and know what to look for safety.
And one last question for me. So do you talk to the patients, like, for example, if the drug is working, it's one thing to see the science part, the human interest, the human side, where, you're having a conversation and you realize that they should be better. You know what I'm saying?
Yeah. And so I would say, at least for the AHEAD study, we're not able to talk about that. One of their cognitive outcomes is some composite measure of cognitive tests, like 5 or 6 cognitive tests that somebody does, and they get a composite measure of cognition. That's sort of the primary outcome. They want to see if this study drug, lecanemab, slows the rate of decline on this big cognitive battery that we would do. So because it is double blinded and we're not really able to release the scores to those participants, like here's where you started, 3 months later, here's your score, 8 months later, here's your score. We're not able to talk about that, but we do have other, what we call observational studies at the ADRU, where we see people for yearly visits and do sort of, cognitive tests and physical check-ins. And there we can talk about how people are doing. We can tell them, I don't know if you're on the study drug or not, but you seem to be doing stable. Maybe that's because of the study drug, but that's information.
We have about one more minute to go, everybody.
Oh, okay. But yeah, unfortunately not for this study.
And there is compensation for every single one of those visits, $40 per visit. We offer free transportation to our offices, and we just have to put people at ease. There's a lot of all this technical language. I would speak to it at a more conversational level where people can be put at ease, and we make sure that people understand everything, every step of the way. We really take care. But now I just want to close with, this is Black History Month, and I just found out over the weekend that the first African-American psychiatrist was on the forefront of Alzheimer's disease. In fact, he worked with Mr. Alzheimer, Alois Alzheimer in Germany back in the late 1800s. And so people understood that there was an African-American involved in the study. And some of the research currently underway, he was a part of. His name is Dr. Solomon Carter Fuller.
1 minute. And Vanessa, your telephone number again?
It is 203. I don't call myself. 764 764 5786. 203 764 5786 or 203 764 8100 will get you to me or Dr. Dr. Odell or any of the other clinicians here.
Harry's going to play the music to sign us off, but Dr. Odell and Vanessa, really thank you for the detail and the explanation and
Thank
the
you.
compassion and your compassion comes really through about the need for this. Reverend Perry, Reverend Clayton, as always, good to see you guys.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you
Thank
for
you.
having us.
As I got another rhyme, another rhythm for y'all to listen. I'm never quitting on my mission. I'ma roll with what I'm giving. Got some ambition, this new edition, filling positions. Looking at the void in myself and feeling what's missing. Better watch the way you going, better go in the right direction. In the moment you stressing, but you gon' be counting blessings. And I know that for certain. Keep on working, open curtains, haters swerving, cause they ain't ready for your final version. Whoa. I'm never gonna give up. Fall down, I just gotta get up, yeah. Cause this is my road. Let's camera action already.